The H1B guy here, and today, the H1B guy dissects H1B denial rates through the second quarter of fiscal year 2020. But before we get started, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't already, to please subscribe to the H1B guy channel here on YouTube. It helps me to produce more content like this for you. I also wanted to mention that the H1B guy offers one-on-one or one-to-many consulting services, whether that be in the form of document and evidence review, work authorization, third-party process, education, and training. I'd love to hear how I can help you. In a research paper posted in August of 2020 by the National Foundation for American Policy, NFAP, who is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to public policy research on trade, immigration, education, and other issues of national importance, the paper titled H-1B Denial Rates Through Second Quarter of FY 2020. Quote, the denial rate for initial employment through the second quarter of fiscal year 2020 when compared to fiscal year 2015 increased by 20 percentage points over or more for 10 major companies that provide IT services or other business consulting services. We've discussed the big tech companies and their use of H-1B visas, and we've also covered at length the third-party consultant. The irony in new employment denials is that these are petitions that are either filed in the annual HCap lottery, selected and then denied, or an H-1B change of employer transfer petitions. When referring to IT services or other business consulting, they are specifically covering the Indian integrators, U.S. staffing firms, and U.S. consulting firms who are filing petitions. Of course, this is really only one side of the story. Without the reasons for the denial, we're merely speculating as to why the data is what it is. I'd be willing to bet most are due to a lack of evidence verifying right of control in employer-employee relationship or the determination of a specialty occupation based on the position requirements. Back to the paper. Quote, denial rates for initial employment for H-1B petitions were generally between 1% and 5% for fiscal year 2015 for the top employers of H-1B professionals, compared to the denial rates that were mostly ranged from 15% to as high as 59% through the first two quarters of fiscal year 2020. Here we see the continued scrutiny on new H-1B employment targeted at H-1Bs that would be working at an end client via third-party consultant outsourcing. Back to the paper. Quote, USCIS data released on the third quarter of fiscal year 2020, April, May, and June, does not separate initial and continuing cases, but it shows a lower denial rate of 4.1%. Continuing employment cases typically have lower denial rates, and there are usually many more of them, which can skew the numbers. We'll briefly discuss the continuing employment numbers at the end of this video, but it's worth highlighting that continuing employment extensions or amendments filed with the current employer, denial rates are typically much lower. Back to the paper. Quote, on June 17, 2020, as part of a settlement with the business group ITServe Alliance, USCIS issued a new policy memo on June 17th of 2020, and withdrew a February 2018 memo on contracts and itineraries requirements for H-1B petitions involving third-party work sites. USCIS also rescinded the Neufeld memo issued on January 8, 2010. The Neufeld memo used a test to determine if an employer-employee relationship existed, including for work at customer sites by H-1B visa holders that could be interpreted in a restrictive way. This past June was a fairly big win in the courts as it relates to third-party work sites and the employer-employee relationship. Unfortunately, it did not take the current administration very long to react to the rulings. Look no further than the DHS memo strengthening the H-1B non-immigrant visa classification program, which we covered here on this channel. That release was for White House review. The release seeks to strengthen the definition of the specialty occupation, revise the definition of the employer-employee relationship, and give more authority to the Department of Labor for wage audits. Back to the research article. Quote, USCIS ran a second H1B cap lottery after fiscal year 2021 quota of 85,000 was not reached during the initial filing period, according to the Fragaman law firm. Employers whose H1B registrations were selected in the second drawing will have from August 17th to November 16th, 2020 to submit their petitions. Adjudications of those petitions would show up in the data for the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2020 and in fiscal year 2021. In my career working with H1Bs and submitting petitions in the HCap lottery, I don't ever recall the lottery reopening. If you do, help jog my memory. Please let me know in the comments below. Back to the paper. Quote, the denial rate for H-1B petitions for continuing employment, primarily for existing employees, was 10% in the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, compared to denying only 3% of H-1B petitions for continuing employment in fiscal year 2015, and only 5% as recently as fiscal year 2017. As we've previously mentioned, continuing employment data gives us a slightly different story. Denials are up 7% over the last 5 years, but the total number of denials themselves are lower in the continuing employment category. No doubt, there is much more security in being a perm employee working directly for their employer than it is working on an end client site. It could also be due to the fact that there are a lower number of petitions are being filed. And back to the paper, quote, for reasons not explained on the H-1B Employer Data Hub website, USCIS did not make data available for H-1B petitions for continuing employment for the second quarter of fiscal year 2020. Interestingly, this data wasn't available. I'm really curious to see the total number of continuing employment petitions that were filed during this time period. This data would cover January, February, and March of 2020. I will say I like how the NFAP presents the research analysis. Definitely has a pro-immigration slant to it, but they do claim to be non-political and non-partisan. We'll continue to monitor the H-1B denials as long as they continue to make the data available. For the full post on H-1B denials through the second quarter of fiscal year 2020, please check out the H1BGuy.com. And if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube, and select all for notifications so that you're notified anytime a new post goes up on the H1B Guy channel. If you've made it this far, I would like to say thank you for taking time to watch my content. I just really appreciate your support. The H1B Guy, your global source for all things H1B.